Hello! Today we're looking at one of the major motivations for open theism. The idea is that God knowing your future actions is inconsistent with you having libertarian free will. Here's the informal version of the argument. Look, God's knowledge is infallible. That means whatever is in his knowledge is going to definitely be true no matter what. So if God knows that I'm going to freely choose to go to the park tomorrow, then I can't do anything to prove his knowledge wrong. But choosing to stay home tomorrow would disprove his knowledge of what I do tomorrow. Therefore, I can't choose to stay home tomorrow. I must go to the park. So, knowledge of the future and libertarian free will are incompatible. Funnily enough, divine determinists will also endorse this argument sometimes, but they'll throw out libertarian free will rather than God's knowledge of the future. Now, the argument in its current form relies heavily on intuition. We haven't made a formal and logically valid argument yet. However, formalizing this argument is actually really hard. To even begin constructing an argument like this, we'll need to give specific definitions of a couple words. Possibly, actually, and necessarily. Going to our good old branching timeline illustration, something possibly occurs if it happens on at least one specific timeline. Something is necessary if it occurs on all possible timelines, and something is actual if it happens in the timeline of the real world. The idea here is that these different properties have well-defined rules about their relations between each other. For example, if X is actual, then X is also possible. If not X is not possible, then X is necessary, and so on. What the open theist, or divine determinist, has to try and do is use all these rules about possibility and necessity and whatnot to get from God knows that I will actually do X tomorrow, all the way to I will necessarily do X tomorrow. This is because libertarian free will requires that me choosing X is possible, and me not choosing X is also possible. So if me choosing X is necessary, I don't have free will. The problem for the open theist is the way God's knowledge is defined. It's defined as infallibly tracking everything that is actually true. So saying God knows X is the same as saying X is actually true. They mean the exact same thing as far as the underlying logic is concerned. Whatever you can deduce from one, you could also deduce from the other. That means that saying, God knows that I will actually do X tomorrow, is the same as saying, I will actually do X tomorrow. At this point, the open theist has two routes of argumentation. First, they could argue that the only way we can have this definition of God's knowledge is by accepting open theism. Secondly, they could argue that I will actually do X tomorrow does somehow entail that I necessarily will do X tomorrow. Let's look at this first route. The open theist might posit that the way God gets his knowledge about the outcome of indeterministic events has to be through something like observation. That's the only way to possibly get that kind of information. But you can only observe something that exists, and the only things that exist are in the present. So God can only observe the indeterministic events in the present, and therefore cannot know the outcomes of indeterministic events in the future. So if God is going to have knowledge of all truths, there can't be any truths about the future. You need to adopt an open future. Something like that. A theist who espouses simple foreknowledge would disagree by saying that the B theory of time is true, so God is outside of the already existing timeline and can observe all the indeterministic events in it. The Molinist will simply reject the premise that God needs to observe indeterministic events to know their outcome. They take the position that God, for whatever reason, can access this information without the need for observation. The arguments around this second route are thousands of years old, going back to Aristotle, and there are a lot of different views out there. But at the very least, I think it's safe to say that it's quite difficult to establish that I will actually do X tomorrow entails somehow that I will necessarily do X tomorrow. Such a leap will require invoking metaphysical principles, which one is simply free to reject. And that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe or support me on Patreon if you enjoy this content.